Today, I'm going to show you how to make the perfect flaky all butter pie crust with an easy hack for shaping it. And we're going to include 2 different shapes as well. So let's get started. So I'm going to put this together in a food processor, and I want all of the ingredients to be nice and cold. So all of the utensils, all of the bowls, everything is going to stay nice and cold so that it's going to help to keep the crust, once it's all put together, nice and cold. So I'm going to pulse my dry ingredients. You can absolutely use a bowl with a pastry cutter for this process. You would just whisk it with a fork, and then you can mix in the butter with a pastry cutter. But in this case, I'm using the food processor because I can just pulse it just enough to get the ingredients to come together. And in this case, I'm using little small cubes of frozen butter. I refrigerated them, but then about 20 minutes before putting this dough together, I put them in the freezer to get them really, really nice and cold. And so as the butter breaks down, it's going to warm up a bit. So we really want to start with cold fat so that it's going to help to incorporate in the pie crust. It's going to allow those flaky layers to appear. So I'm going to pulse it until we've got a nice like crumb mixture, and the butter is going to be in little tiny pieces. And my secret tip for this is adding an egg white along with the ice water. No, the egg white will not impact the flakiness of the dough, I promise you. But what it's going to do is it's going to help to hold together the dough so that it doesn't fall apart when you're trying to roll it. It just makes it so much simpler, and it really, really helps the texture, and it will not negatively impact it in any way. Trust me, this is the flakiest pie crust, and the egg white will not negatively impact it. So please, I would love for you to give this a shot, because when you pulse it, you're going to see that it's going to easily kind of form together. And when I dump it out onto the table to form it, it's going to just adhere so much better because the egg white is a nice binder. And so I just find that it works perfectly for a pie crust. So I'm going to dump everything out onto my counter, and then I'm going to form it into a single kind of flat disc. And you can kind of see it really easily comes together because of that extra egg white. Otherwise, it might be kind of crumbling and falling apart. So I'm going to actually take a metal scraper, and I'm going to cut this in half. So this is going to make 2 pie crusts, and I'm going to form them into 2 small discs. And when I form them, you don't really want to really knead it or anything like that. You just want to form it together and try to flatten out the top so that it will spread a little bit more easily after it rests when you roll it out. So I'm going to take some parchment paper. You can also use wax paper, but parchment is going to be your best friend for this because I'm actually going to use this to roll it out. So we're going to form each ball of pie crust in the parchment paper, and then we're going to rest them in the fridge for at least 30 minutes. And this is going to help the gluten to relax. Now we're going to roll out the pie crust using the parchment paper that we wrapped it in. Plus, we're going to grab 1 extra piece of parchment paper and place it underneath. So we're going to sandwich the dough in between the parchment paper while we're rolling it out. Again, you can use wax paper for this, but I prefer to use parchment because for the crostata, I'm actually going to bake it with the parchment paper underneath. I really don't like to bake with wax paper because it just imparts a little bit of a flavor. But probably the biggest problem when rolling out pie crust is that it can often kind of break apart sometimes, because you really don't want to knead it or work it a lot because that's going to make it tougher, and that's going to not lend a flaky pie crust. So this allows me to really easily roll it out without the pieces breaking up. And if anything does break apart, you can easily seal it back together under the parchment. So in this case, I'm actually going to make a crostata first. So I'm going to place it on a sheet pan, but I can actually re-chill it at this point and put it back in the fridge to make sure it's nice and cold before baking. Now, a crostata or a galette is a free-form pie. It is just as wonderful as a pie dough, but it's actually far easier to shape. So it's actually my preferred method for making fruit pies, especially because it just works so well with them. So I have it directly on the sheet pan, and I'm keeping the parchment underneath it because I'm going to bake it directly on that. And I'm going to lift the parchment up and help to release the pie crust, and I'm just going to fold it onto itself, just overlap the edges, and then I'll put an egg wash around the rim and bake it. Now for a traditional pie crust, here I think the pie crust had warmed up just a tiny bit. So you really want to make sure it's nice and cold. So you can see it's kind of tearing just a tiny bit as you pull it off. So that's really why you want to keep it nice and cold. But as I was able to invert it on a pie pan, you could see how easily it all came together. So it's actually really easy to make sure that it's the right at the right spot around the pie pan, and you can move it around and lift it up if you need to adjust it a lot easier, because the parchment paper allows you to do that. So again, I'm going to refrigerate it again since I have worked with it to make sure that it's really nice and cold, and that'll actually make it easier to remove the parchment. And so on the edges here, I'm just going to make sure that everything is nice and even. I'm just going to use some kitchen scissors to cut off a couple of pieces. And so at this point, if you have any tears or any parts that kind of break or that are a little bit uneven, you can use the extra little pieces to patch any areas up. I did have to patch up an area on the right side of the pie dough, as you can see. So I'm going to start shaping it by tucking the rim underneath itself. And this is going to make a little bit of a thicker base for shaping it, and it's going to help it to hold together better when you actually bake the crust. So we're going to try to get it nice and even, and then we're just going to do a traditional pie shell shape. There's a couple different ways you can pinch it, but I'm just using my index and middle finger and my other finger to shape it really easily. And again, as you're working with it, the pie is probably going to warm up a bit. So it's really important when working with pie dough to, if it warms up, put it back in the fridge. Cover it, put it back in the fridge, and keep it nice and cold before baking. Now this is that beautiful peach crostata. It is golden and delicious and flaky. Look how flaky that pastry is. This is a French beer quiche. So I made a quiche with the other pie crust, and it's unbelievably flaky, so delicious. Both of the recipes are on BessieBakes.com. I hope you enjoy.